Hello and welcome to the first video in the Echoes and Curves Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. I'm Angela Walters and I'm excited to get started on the newest Free Motion Challenge. In this video, we're going to learn how to quilt serpentine lines. The serpentine line design works great in thinner borders and sashings, as well as differently shaped blocks. We'll learn how to troubleshoot common frustrations, and I'll demonstrate it on both a sewing machine and a long arm. Plus, I'll throw in a few tips along the way. Before we get to quilting, let me show you what the design looks like. So before you start, go ahead and mark or quilt 2 lines, about 2 to 3 inches apart. These will act as the boundaries that we're going to fill in. And I'm just going to use this handy stencil to do that quickly. The serpentine line starts from either side, and it's going to be a line that's going to curve out, but then as I approach the other side, it's going to change direction and run into that other side, making a nice elongated S shape. Now, one thing I want to point out is that one end will be higher than the other. Once I hit the edge of the area, though, then I'm going to travel up about 1/4 of an inch or so, and then I'm going to echo the line I've just quilted until I run back into my other side. Again, repeating to travel and come up, quilting that serpentine line. I'm just echoing that line I've already quilted, so once I get the first one down, the rest should be easy going. All right, so now that we see kind of what this design looks like, let's go to the machine and start quilting it. Starting from one side of my area, I'm going to quilt that line that swoops out and then changes direction. Once I get to the other side, I'm going to stop and then travel along the seam for about 1/4 inch or so. A good rule of thumb will be when my foot touches my previously quilted line, that's a good place to stop. And then I'm going to do the same thing, quilting that line that curves out, changes direction, and runs into the other side. When that happens, travel up and then echo my way back down. When I'm quilting this, I tend to think of it almost like an on-ramp and an off-ramp. Now, what makes this design so versatile is that it can go up from either side. So looking at my serpentine line, the left side is lower than the right side, but I could have quilted it the opposite way with the right side being lower. Okay, I've went ahead and marked out another boundary. Let's keep going with this design. The reason that the serpentine line doesn't work so great in larger borders is that it only has that one change of direction. So once we get to bigger areas like 6, 7, 8 inches wide, it's really hard to sustain that curve for that long. And since the design can be quilted in either direction, if I were quilting multiple strips, I could go ahead and start working my way back down, quilting the serpentine line in the opposite direction. Now, I'm quilting this design vertically because that's how I prefer to move my hands. However, you might find it easier to work horizontally, so be sure to try both directions to see if there's one that feels better. Now let's troubleshoot some common issues with this design. I've taught this design in a lot of classes and I know the common problems that some quilters will face. Not that I'm saying you'll have trouble with it, but you know, just in case. While this serpentine line does have the correct curve, one side isn't much higher than the other. I really want to quilt it so it's stretched out. I think it just looks nicer and it helps you progress along the quilt faster. Now, if your serpentine lines are looking a little bit more like this, it just means that we have too many changes of direction in that line. Remember, I want a nice curve. I don't want a lot of wave to it. Now, if your serpentine lines are looking like this, congratulations, you are almost there. The issue here is that the spacing isn't consistent between the lines. When the spacing between the lines is consistent, you don't notice the individual lines as much, you just see the overall design. While this doesn't look bad, if you want a more serpentine kind of textured look, try to keep that spacing as consistent as possible. If you're struggling with that serpentine line design, I have a downloadable PDF and tip sheet that you can print out and practice drawing over it. I've even included an up-close picture of the quilting on the panel. If you want, you can almost use it like a stencil. Mark over the lines with a marker and then mark it on your quilt. You can even take the thread out of your machine and quilt right on the diagrams to perforate it and use it just like a stencil. You can place it right over your panel or your fabric and take your pounce pad and mark it out. Having those guidelines will make it a lot easier when it comes time to quilt. Okay, now that we know how the design goes together, we've done a little practicing, now let's go ahead and apply this design to the class quilt. I'm going to be demonstrating all the designs in this challenge on the class panel. If you want to find out about the panel or other machine quilting supplies, check out my website, fmqchallenge.com. Now you might notice the area on the panel that I'll be working in isn't exactly a rectangle. Try not to let that distract you. Just like we did on the practice sandwich, I'm going to quilt that line that curves out, changes direction, and then runs into the other side of the seam, making sure that one side is further ahead than the other. Once I hit the seam, I'm just going to travel along for about 1/4 of an inch and then echo my way back down. So here's a few tips for quilting this design. First of all, look ahead of where you're going. Since I'm trying to run into the edge of the area, I need to kind of know when it's coming up. Look a couple of inches ahead and trust your hands to bring you to that point. Also, focus on keeping the line smooth. Even if it isn't a perfect serpentine line, if it's smooth, it's going to look better. Now when I get to here, this is where my area starts to change shape. I need to travel along the seam, just like I've already been doing. It's just going to go at an angle since that's the way the seam is going. I'm going to keep quilting those serpentine lines in that area, filling it in as much as possible. And there we have the serpentine line in our first section. Now when I move on to the next area, all I have to do is simply shift the quilt and start quilting in that direction. It's not ideal having to turn the quilt. However, it's a lot easier to learn how to quilt it in one direction and then learn how to quilt it in all different ways. Once you learn how to quilt that serpentine line, then you get to practice trying to land perfectly on that seam. If you're struggling to get that line perfectly on the seam, you might find that straight rulers will help you out. Now, that sounds a little weird, but not for the reason you might think. I'm going to use them as a boundary on both sides to keep from quilting over the line. At this point, I'm treating them almost like a handle of the quilt. They're helping me move the quilt and keeping my quilting where it needs to stay. And even if one line looks a little weird, don't worry about it. When the whole area is filled in, it's going to look great. Now, let me show you how to quilt this design on a long arm. I've been using this dark blue thread so that you can really see the quilting that I'm doing. However, if you bought the coordinating thread collection, for this section, you're going to want to use the pale mist thread. Now, pale mist does have a greenish tint, but here's what's amazing about thread color. When you put it on top of the fabric, it's almost the perfect shade for that lighter blue. It just goes to show that you should try out several different colors because the right one just might surprise you. There is a little bit of a difference when you're quilting the serpentine lines on the long arm. You can't change the orientation of the quilt, so you're going to have to learn how to quilt this design in all different directions. The tip here is to practice in one direction continually until you get the hang of it, and then learn how to quilt it in all different directions. Okay, now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the panel, fill in the area highlighted in red with the serpentine lines. Okay, so on a personal note, I know there's so much craziness out there right now. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you watching the videos. Your support means that I can still run my business even if I have to do it from home. So I can't thank you enough for your support. If you have any questions, you can leave them on the video, or better yet, join our Facebook group. The Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along Facebook group is a great place to connect with other quilters, to share pictures of what you're doing, and also to ask questions. And next week, we're going to learn how to quilt variations of the serpentine line design and talk about turning the corner. You can find all the details in the description box below, or you can also visit fmqchallenge.com.